Is it called Vulpecula?
That was terrible. Say it again?
Only if you keep smiling like that. You were supposed to survive without me.
I already chose who I'm waking up beside.
Hey viewer! Support us on our Patreon to get your own custom stories and animations. And listen to us free on Spotify. Both links are below.
The reactor core of Elias 9 had been failing for 11 days, and Elias Ward had stopped sleeping on day 4. He sat now in the narrow maintenance corridor beneath Havering 3, a wrench loose in his grip, listening to the colony breathe its last labored breaths through the ventilation ducts above him. The sound was wrong. It had been wrong for a week, a thin, whistling rasp where there should have been the steady thrum of recyclers working in harmony. Elias 9 was dying the way an old animal dies, quietly, from the inside out, and there was nothing left in his toolkit that could fix it. He was 34 years old. He had the calloused hands of a man who had spent a decade doing work that was never meant to be permanent, and the tired eyes of someone who had watched too many ships leave without him. When the Vulpine settlement had first been founded on Elias 9, a joint colonial venture between 3 struggling worlds, humans among them, brought together by treaties and desperation more than by choice, Elias had been one of 40 human engineers assigned to maintain its atmospheric systems. Now he was the only one left. The others had gone 8 months ago, when the first evacuation order came through and the colony's fate had still seemed uncertain rather than sealed. Elias remembered standing on the landing pad, watching the transport ships lift off one by one, their engines scorching the frostbitten tarmac, and feeling something in his chest refuse to let his feet move toward the boarding ramp. He had told himself it was duty. He had told himself the Vulpine settlers needed someone who understood the reactor's failing heart, someone who could keep the lights on a little longer, keep the children's dormitories warm a little longer. He had not let himself examine the other reason too closely. Not then. The corridor around him bore the marks of a station that had given up pretending things were fine. Panel lights that had once glowed a reassuring blue now flickered amber or dark. Frost feathered the seams between decking plates, thin white traceries that thickened a little more each day as the climate systems lost their fight against the cold bleeding in from outside. Somewhere above, a structural groan rolled through the station's bones, the sound Elias had come to think of as Elias 9 shifting in its sleep, settling deeper into whatever failure would eventually claim it whole. He had learned, over 11 days, to stop flinching at the sound. It no longer meant anything was about to happen. It only meant the ending was continuing, the way endings did, in small increments rather than a single dramatic collapse. He rubbed at his eyes with the back of one grease-stained hand and considered, not for the first time, how strange it was that exhaustion this deep no longer felt like exhaustion at all. It felt like a kind of clarity. The world narrowed down to exactly what mattered. Keep the reactor breathing, keep the corridors warm, keep the last handful of people on this station alive one more day than the last one. Above him, footsteps, light, quick, deliberate. He knew the gate before he saw her. "You are not sleeping again," Sarethi said, crouching at the maintenance hatch, her golden eyes catching what little emergency lighting remained in the corridor. Her voice held the particular cadence Vulpine's speech took on when translated through the neural implant most humans on Elias 9 had accepted years ago. Musical, layered, carrying beneath the words a low current of subvocal sound that pure translation software could never fully render. "Your scent has changed, Elias. Exhaustion sits on you like frost. Reactor's not going to fix itself," he said, not looking up. "Neither will you, if you fall into it." He allowed himself a small, tired laugh at that, and finally looked up at her. Sarethi crouched with the effortless grace of her kind, her tail curled loosely around her ankles even in the cramped space, her rust-tan cream fur catching the auxiliary light in a way that made her look, for a moment, like something carved rather than born. An old Vulpine expression, he'd learned, for someone whose bloodline ran deep and rare. She was not colony royalty in the sense humans understood royalty, no crown or court, but among the remaining Vulpine of Alaris 9 she carried a different kind of weight. She was the last unbroken line of the Kelthar bloodline, a genetic thread that stretched back through 11 known generations of healers, sensitives, and, if the old stories were to be believed, the rare Vulpine capable of what her people called deep bonding, a physiological synchronization between mates so complete it had passed into myth even among her own kind. She was 26 by Vulpine reckoning, which put her roughly in line with human 28, and she had spent the last 3 years of the colony's decline working beside Elias more often than not, first as his translator liaison, then, gradually, as something he had stopped trying to name. "The council wants to see you," she said. "Both of us." Elias set down the wrench. Something in her voice, a flatness that Vulpine's speech did not naturally carry, told him this was not a routine summons. "They found the pod," she said. He had not always intended to stay. Elias could still remember, with an almost physical clarity, the day he had first stepped off the transport shuttle onto Alaris 9's landing pad. 26 years old, freshly certified in atmospheric systems engineering, carrying a duffel bag and a 5-year contract he'd signed mostly because the pay was good and the posting was far enough from home that no one would ask him difficult questions about why he'd left. The colony had still been young then, still optimistic in the particular way new settlements were optimistic before reality got a chance to argue with them. 40 human engineers, a Vulpine settler population numbering in the low thousands, and a joint council still convinced that Alaris 9 would become a model for the kind of interspecies cooperation the wider sector had never quite managed to sustain. Sarethi had been assigned to his survey team in his second week, a translator liaison fresh out of her own training, formal to the point of stiffness, correcting his mispronunciation of technical terms with a patience that had, at the time, struck him as faintly exhausting. "You are saying it as though it were a curse," she told him once, watching him fumble through a Vulpine phrase for coolant conduit during a routine inspection. "It is a pipe, Elias Ward. Not an insult." "It sounds like an insult when I say it," he'd admitted, and she had made a sound then, quick, startled, quickly suppressed, that he would later come to recognize as the beginning of her laugh, the one she rarely let slip fully in those early months. He had not thought much of it at the time. There had been 40 other engineers, a colony full of new relationships forming in the particular hothouse way isolated postings encouraged, and he had told himself, more than once, that whatever he felt watching her patiently correct his grammar was simply the ordinary fondness of two people thrown together by circumstance. It had taken the first winter, the failed heating grid, the 18 hours in sub-zero corridors, her waiting for him afterward with a blanket and an expression he hadn't yet learned to read, for him to admit, privately, that it might be more than that. And it had taken 2 more years, and a colony's slow collapse, for him to admit it to anyone else, including, eventually, himself. By the time the evacuation orders came, 39 of the 40 engineers had boarded transports without a second thought. Elias remembered standing on the same landing pad where he'd first arrived, watching the ships lift off, and understanding, with a clarity that had frightened him at the time, that leaving was no longer something his body would let him choose. Not because of duty alone. Because somewhere in 3 years of pipe corrections and shared winters and 100 small unremarkable kindnesses, Sarethi had become the reason Alaris 9 felt less like a posting and more like something he could not imagine walking away from. He had never told her that directly. It had seemed, for a long time, like an indulgence a dying colony could not afford either of them. The council chamber had once held 40 people comfortably. Now it held 6. The last of Alaris 9's governing body, all of them Vulpine, all of them older than Sarethi by decades, their fur dulled with the particular grayness that came from prolonged exposure to a thinning, poorly regulated atmosphere. Elias stood at the room's edge, arms crossed, feeling, as he often did in council sessions, like a guest who had overstayed a welcome nobody had quite revoked. Councillor Vantish, the eldest among them, spoke first. The final cryogenic unit in the medical wing has been restored to function. 1 unit. It draws less power than the failing life support grid and can sustain a single occupant for the estimated 4 months until the rescue convoy arrives. 1 occupant, Elias repeated. The unit was designed for solo emergency stasis, Vantish said. It was never intended to preserve a colony's survival. It is intended to preserve a survival. We have chosen who that will be. Sarethi's ears flattened. A gesture Elias had learned, over 3 years, to read as carefully as any spoken sentence. Displeasure. Perhaps refusal, already forming. The Kelther bloodline, Vantish continued, is the last of its kind remaining in this colony, and one of only 3 known unbroken lines in Vulpine space. Sarethi's survival is not sentiment, Counselor Ward. It is continuity. If she does not leave this station alive, an irreplaceable genetic inheritance, one that generations of healers before her gave their lives to protect, dies with this colony. Then send her, Elias said. Obviously. Send her. I am standing directly in front of you, Sarethi said, and there was an edge in her translated voice sharp enough to cut through the counselor's measured calm. You may address me. Elias exhaled, some of the tightness in his shoulders finally admitting itself. Sarethi. Go. Please. No. The word landed in the chamber like a dropped tool. The pod is yours, Vantish said, an old patience fraying at its edges. The council has decided. There is no negotiation to be had. There is, Sarethi said, because I will not enter it alone. Vantish's ears pinned back, a gesture of frustration he made no effort to conceal. Then explain to this council what alternative you imagine exists. The unit accepts 1 occupant. That is not a policy this body has imposed upon you, Sarethi. It is a limitation of the equipment itself. We did not choose to make this cruel. The universe made it cruel long before we convened this session. Then the council can spend its remaining hours finding a way around a cruelty instead of simply accepting it. Sarethi said. You have asked me to be the last of my bloodline for my entire life, Counselor. You have never once asked me what I would choose to preserve, given the chance to choose at all. I am choosing now. Sentiment, Vantish said, though something in his voice had softened, is a luxury a dying colony cannot always afford. With respect, Elias said, speaking for the first time in nearly an hour. I've spent 3 years watching this colony run on exactly the opposite principle. You didn't survive this long by treating each other as expendable. You survived because people kept choosing each other over convenience, over and over, long after it stopped being easy. Maybe that's sentiment. I'd call it the only thing that actually held this place together. Vantish studied him for a long moment, an assessing look Elias had grown used to over the years, the particular Vulpine habit of weighing a person's scent and posture as carefully as their words. Whatever he found there seemed, if not to satisfy him, at least to give him pause. 2 days, Vantish said finally. You may spend 2 days searching the archives for an alternative the Council is not aware of. If none exists, Sarethi, you will board that pod as instructed, with or without your consent, because this Council will not allow one stubborn heart to cost this colony its future twice over. 2 days, Sarethi agreed, though the look she gave Elias as they left the chamber suggested she had no intention of honoring the second half of that ultimatum. They argued for 3 hours. Elias said almost nothing during most of it. There was little a human engineer with no formal standing could contribute to a council debate about bloodlines and colonial continuity, but he watched Sarethi hold her ground against 6 elders with a stubbornness that would have looked, on a human face, like fury, and on hers looked instead like something quieter and more devastating, certainty. When the council finally adjourned, unable to move her, Elias followed her out into the frost-rimed corridor that led back toward the residential wing. The lights here flickered in time with the reactor's uneven pulse, and their breath fogged faintly even indoors. The atmospheric processors could no longer keep pace with the cold bleeding in from the station's hull. "You have to take it," he said. "Sarethi, listen to me. This isn't about the council. This is about you living. I am listening, she said, not slowing her pace. I have been listening to you for 3 years, Elias Ward. It is your turn to listen to me. She stopped outside the observation window that looked out over what remained of Alaris IX's agricultural dome, half collapsed now, its crops long since frozen and blackened, a monument to everything the colony had once tried to build. Sarethi's reflection hung faint and golden in the frosted glass beside his own tired one. When the humans left, she said, you stayed. Do you remember what you told the council then? You said a colony that abandons its most vulnerable in order to save its own convenience does not deserve to call itself a people. You said you would rather stay and fail than leave and live with what leaving meant. That was different. It was not. She turned to face him, and he saw, for the first time and longer than he wanted to admit, something raw beneath her composure. You rationed your own oxygen for the creche children during the second pressure failure. I watched you do it. You did not tell anyone. I only knew because I could smell what it cost you, the way exhaustion changes a body's chemistry. You have spent 3 years teaching every soul on this station, myself included, that a life's value is not a ledger to be balanced. That we do not calculate who deserves saving by what they can offer in return. Her voice caught and steadied. You taught me that lesson, Elias. And now you ask me to abandon it the very first time it costs me something. My bloodline means nothing to me if the price of preserving it is leaving behind the one person who taught me it should not be for sale. He didn't have an answer for that. He had spent years being careful never to let himself want an answer to the question underneath her words, because wanting it had always seemed like a luxury a dying colony couldn't afford him. The pod is built for one, he said quietly. That's not a rule I can argue with. That's physics. Then we will find another way, Sarethi said. Because I am not leaving you to die alone in the dark so that I can live with the weight of it. It was Sarethi who found the record, 3 sleepless days later, buried in the colony's oldest medical archive. Data salvaged from the original founding expedition, back when Alaris IX had been meant as a joint research outpost rather than a refugee settlement, and Vulpine reproductive and bonding physiology had still been studied with academic curiosity rather than desperate necessity. She found Elias in the reactor bay, elbow deep in a coolant manifold that had no business still functioning, and dropped a data tablet onto the workbench beside him hard enough that he startled. There is a protocol, she said, breathless in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. An experimental one. Dual-occupant cryogenic stasis. He wiped his hands on a rag that had long since stopped being clean and picked up the tablet. The file was old, predating the colony's founding by at least 2 decades, marked with classification headers from a research division that no longer existed under that name. 2 people, he read aloud. In a pod built for one. The unit does not simply preserve a single body's biological processes, Sarethi said, crouching beside him, her tail flicking with the restless energy she got when a problem finally had an edge to grip. It regulates them, heartbeat, respiration, core temperature, against a fixed baseline it is calibrated to expect. The reason it cannot support 2 occupants under normal operation is that 2 separate, unsynchronized biological rhythms would overwhelm its regulation capacity. It would run out of power trying to stabilize 2 different systems independently. Right, Elias said slowly. So how does this help us? It helps us, Sarethi said, if the 2 systems are not independent. If they are synchronized, if 2 bodies share one rhythm instead of 2 competing ones, the unit only has to regulate a single baseline. Shared heartbeat. Shared respiration cycle. Shared core temperature, maintained through direct physical contact rather than through the pod's environmental systems doing the work twice over. Elias stared at her. That's not how physiology works. Human and Vulpine physiology, especially, our baselines aren't even close. No, she agreed. Not naturally. But among my people, there is an old bonding practice, nearly extinct now, treated as folklore by my own generation, called Sarethi. Deep bonding. It was developed for mated pairs undertaking long, dangerous voyages in early Vulpine deep space exploration, before reliable life support existed. Two bonded partners, through prolonged physical contact, controlled breathing, and neural synchronization facilitated by pheromonal exchange, could bring their bodies into close enough alignment that shared survival systems became possible. It was never meant for permanent use. It was meant for exactly this: a bridge across a gap that would otherwise kill you both. And it's never been done between species, Elias said. No. Sarethi held his gaze steady despite the admission. It has not. Sarethi. I know what I am asking, she said. I know the risk is real, and I know I cannot promise you it will work. But I would rather share an uncertain chance with you than accept a certain one without you. That night, if the word night still meant anything on a station where the artificial day cycle had begun drifting along with everything else, Elias sat alone in the crew quarters that had once housed 40 engineers and now housed exactly one, and let himself remember. He remembered the first time he had seen Sarethi, 3 years and 2 months ago, when she had been assigned as his translator liaison during the initial atmospheric survey of the colony's failing Western processors. She had been formal then, careful, maintaining the particular distance Vulpine culture taught its people to keep with outsiders, a distance he had, at the time, assumed was simply how things would remain between them. He remembered the second month, when she had started correcting his pronunciation of Vulpine technical terms without being asked, an unprompted kindness that had made him laugh out loud for the first time since arriving on Elias 9. He remembered the first winter, when the eastern dormitory's heating had failed and he had spent 18 hours straight rerouting power conduits through sub-zero corridors, and had emerged to find Sarethi waiting for him with a thermal blanket and an expression he hadn't yet learned to read, and had learned, later, was worry. He remembered the pressure failure in the creche, 11 months ago. The reason his lungs still ached faintly on cold days, the reason he told no one what he'd quietly done with his own oxygen allotment that week, except that Sarethi, apparently, had known all along. He remembered 100 small things, the way she purred, low and almost subliminal, when a problem finally clicked into place beneath her hands, the particular flick of her ears when she was suppressing amusement at something he'd said. The evening, from months ago, when her tail had brushed against his ankle during a council session and neither of them had moved away, and something unspoken had settled into the space between them and simply stayed there. He remembered, too, a quieter evening than most, 6 months back, before the reactor's decline had become the only subject anyone on the station could speak about. They had climbed together to the observation deck above Habring 2, one of the few places on Elias 9 where the reinforced viewport still offered an unobstructed view of open space, and had sat in a silence that had never once felt like the awkward kind. Sarethi had pointed out constellations her people navigated by, old Vulpine names for star clusters humans catalogued only by number, and Elias had found himself more interested in the low, unhurried cadence of her voice than in the stars themselves. At some point, without either of them remarking on it, her tail had settled across his lap, and he had let his hand rest against it, and they had stayed like that for the better part of an hour, saying very little, needing to say very little. He had walked back to his quarters that night feeling, for the first time in years, something dangerously close to peace. He had never let himself call it love, because love implied a future, and Elias 9 had stopped offering him one months ago. Now, perhaps, it was offering him something else instead, not a future exactly, but a chance. A narrow, frost-rimed, desperately uncertain chance. He found her in the medical wing an hour later, running diagnostics on the pod itself, her tail wrapped tight around her legs in the particular way that meant she was working through fear by working through data instead. "If we do this," he said, "and it doesn't work, then we will have tried," she said, not looking up from the console. "Together. Which is more than the alternative offers either of us. I need you to understand something," he said. "I'm not agreeing to this because I'm afraid to die alone. I've made peace with dying on this station a dozen times over the last 8 months. I'm agreeing because the idea of you closing that pod and leaving me behind so I can watch you go, that's the thing I actually can't survive. Sarethi finally looked up, and her ears lifted, surprise, and something warmer beneath it. That, she said softly, is the most honest thing you have ever said to me. I've been careful, he admitted. For 3 years. Told myself it wasn't fair to want anything from you when I might not be here to keep wanting it. And now there's a chance we might both be here to keep wanting it. So I'm done being careful. The council did not take the proposal well. This protocol has never been tested, Vantish said, pacing the chamber floor with an agitation that made his fur bristle along his spine. It has never been tested within our own species in over 3 generations, let alone across species boundaries. You would be gambling the last Kelther bloodline on folklore, Sarethi. I would be gambling it on physics my own ancestors documented and used successfully, Sarethi said. Folklore is what we call knowledge after we have stopped trusting ourselves to use it. And if it fails? If the pod cannot stabilize 2 unsynchronized bodies and both of you die in the attempt, what becomes of the bloodline then? What becomes of everything 11 generations sacrificed to protect? Then it ends, Sarethi said, and her voice, for the first time in the debate, went quiet rather than sharp, quiet in the way that made every counselor in the room stop moving. It ends the way everything on this station has been ending for the past year, honestly, and without pretending that a bloodline is worth more than the person carrying it. I am not a vessel for the Kelther line, Counselor Vantish. I am Sarethi. And I have decided what my life is for. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Elias found himself holding his breath. It was the youngest counselor, Ithera, who finally spoke, a healer by training, one of the few among them who had studied the old bonding physiology as more than historical curiosity. The Surleth protocol, as documented, required weeks of preparation between bonded partners under normal circumstances. Ritual proximity, pheromonal familiarity, a foundation of trust built over time. It was never attempted as an emergency measure between 2 people meeting the requirement for the first time under duress. We are not meeting anything for the first time, Sarethi said. 3 years is not nothing, Ithera. Whatever foundation the ritual requires. I believe we have already built it. Slowly. Without meaning to. Ithera studied her for a long moment, then looked at Elias with an assessing, clinical gaze that made him feel, not for the first time, like a specimen under observation. Your scent signature has already shifted toward hers, Counselor Ward. I noticed it months ago. I assumed it was simply prolonged proximity. It may be more than that. What does that mean? Elias asked. It means, Ithera said, that whatever this is between you, your bodies may have already begun the process the ritual is meant to accelerate. Which does not guarantee success. But it improves the odds considerably beyond 0. Vantish looked between them for a long moment, old eyes weighing something none of the rest of them could see. The council cannot, in good conscience, endorse this, he said finally. But neither, it seems, can we prevent it. The pod is in the medical wing. The choice, God help us all, appears to already be made. They had 6 days before the reactor's final projected failure, 6 days to prepare a protocol that had not been attempted in 3 generations, between 2 species that had never attempted it at all. Ithra worked with them through most of it, translating the old archived documentation into something approaching a usable procedure, her clinical focus a steadying presence against the fear that neither Elias nor Sarethi spoke aloud but both carried plainly enough in their scent, in their silences, in the way their hands found excuses to stay near each other during the long hours of preparation. The ritual foundation is built through 3 elements, Ithra explained on the 2nd day, as she recalibrated the pod's internal sensors to account for a second occupant for the first time in the unit's operational history. Scent memory, physical synchronization, and voluntary vulnerability. The first, from what I have observed, you have already established without ritual intention. The second and third will require deliberate practice before the transfer. Scent memory, Elias repeated. You mean the way you can tell when I haven't slept? Among other things, Sarethi said, a faint warmth in her voice despite the gravity of the moment. Vulpine scent memory is not a single sense the way human smell is. It is closer to a second language, one that records emotional truth more reliably than words do, because scent does not lie the way speech sometimes must. I have known, for over a year, what you felt for me, Elias. Long before you allowed yourself to say it. He felt his face heat, an entirely human response to an entirely Vulpine confession. That's a little unfair, honestly. Life is rarely fair, she said, though her ears had lifted in unmistakable amusement. It is, however, occasionally kind, in unexpected moments. This may be one of them. Physical synchronization, it turned out, meant something simpler and stranger than Elias had expected. Hours spent simply breathing together, seated close, Sarethi's tail curled around his wrist in a gesture Ithra identified as a foundational bonding posture, until their respiration, naturally mismatched, human lungs and Vulpine lungs built to different rhythms, began, slowly, almost imperceptibly, to draw toward a shared pace. It will not be perfect, Ithra warned. It cannot be across species. But it does not need to be perfect. It needs only to be close enough that the pod's regulatory systems can bridge the remaining gap rather than fighting two fully independent baselines. Voluntary vulnerability, Ithra explained on the fourth day, was the element she could not fully translate into procedure. It is not a technical step, she said. It is a precondition. The bond does not form between two people guarding themselves against each other. It forms between two people who have already chosen to stop. That night, in the near dark of the crew quarters, Elias told Sarethi about his mother's death, 11 years ago, and the year afterward he had spent taking increasingly dangerous colonial engineering postings because staying still and grieving had felt unbearable. He told her about the ships he had watched leave Alaris 9 and the specific, private shame of knowing part of him had wanted to be on one of them, even as another part of him had never once seriously considered going. Sarethi told him, in turn, about the weight of being the last Kelther, about a childhood spent being watched by elders for signs of the healing gifts her bloodline was famous for, gifts that had never fully manifested in her, and the quiet, persistent fear that she was a disappointment to a legacy she had never asked to carry. She told him that some part of her relief at refusing the pod alone had been, if she was honest, relief at finally refusing to be only a bloodline. At choosing, for the first time in her life, to be simply herself. I don't want you to survive because of what your blood can do for your species, Elias said quietly in the dark. I want you to survive because the universe would be measurably worse without you specifically in it. That, Sarethi said, her tail tightening gently around his wrist, is the first time anyone has ever said that to me and meant it as more than comfort. On the morning of the fifth day, Ithra insisted on a supervised trial, not the full protocol, not yet, but a controlled test of their respiratory synchronization using a portable monitor rather than the pod itself. I would rather we discover a failure here, where it costs us nothing but time, she said, than inside a sealed chamber with no second chance. They sat facing each other on the medical wing's narrow observation table, Sarethi's hands folded loosely around his, her eyes closed, her breathing slow and deliberate. Elias matched her as best he could, the way they had practiced for 2 days running, and for a while the monitor's readout climbed steadily, 60%, 64, 69. Then, without warning, it dropped. 51. Ithra read aloud, frowning at the display. Sarethi, your pulse just spiked. Sarethi's eyes opened, and Elias saw, plainly, the fear she had been keeping carefully hidden beneath her composure for 2 days. I am sorry, she said, drawing back slightly. I lost the rhythm. I kept thinking, I kept picturing the pod's ceiling, and something in me simply refused to trust it, even knowing what refusing costs us. That's not a failure, Elias said. That's just fear. I have plenty of my own. Fear the protocol may not survive, Ithra said, not unkindly, but with the bluntness of someone unwilling to let false comfort stand where a real problem needed solving. Sarethi requires trust held under duress, not merely trust in calm moments like this one. If either of you cannot hold the bond once genuine terror enters the chamber, the pod will read it as exactly the kind of divergence it cannot regulate. Sarethi's ears flattened, shame and frustration plain in the gesture. Then we try again. They tried 4 more times that day, and twice more the following morning, the readout climbing and faltering by turns, until, on the 6th attempt, Elias, watching Sarethi's face tighten with the same fear that had broken the rhythm before, did the only thing he could think to do. He let go of trying to control his own breathing entirely, and instead simply pulled her closer, forehead to forehead, and told her, quietly, that he wasn't afraid of the pod failing. He was afraid of a future where he never got the chance to tell her he loved her at all. The readout climbed past 70 without either of them watching it. Past 75. Past 80 and held. There, Ithra said softly, something like relief breaking through her clinical composure for the first time in days. You did not force the rhythm. You simply stopped performing calm and let yourselves be honest instead. That is, I suspect, precisely what the old texts meant by voluntary vulnerability. It was never a technique to master. It was a wall to stop building. On the 5th day, the reactor failed 6 hours ahead of every projection. Elias was in the engine bay when the containment alarms began screaming, red emergency light flooding the corridors, the whole station groaning around them like something enormous and dying. He didn't waste time trying to save the reactor. There was nothing left to save, and instead sprinted for the medical wing, boots slamming against decking that was already beginning to tilt as artificial gravity generators lost their stable power feed. Sarethi met him halfway, Ithra close behind her, all 3 of them half running through corridors where emergency bulkheads were beginning to seal automatically, cutting the station into isolated survival pockets. How much time? Elias shouted over the alarms. Hours, Ithra said grimly. Not days. The atmospheric processors will fail before the reactor's residual power does. We will lose breathable air in this section within 4 hours. They reached the medical wing with the bulkhead already beginning its automatic closure sequence, and Ithra shoved them both through the narrowing gap a half-second before it sealed, then pressed her palm to the intercom panel on the other side. Ithra! Sarethi's voice cracked, raw with something Elias had never heard from her before. Pure, undisguised fear, not for herself. I cannot open it again. Ithra's voice came through, steady despite everything. The seal is load-bearing for the section now. Reversing it risks structural failure throughout this entire wing. Sarethi, listen to me. You do not need me for this final stage. You have done the preparation. The rest is trust, and I have watched you both for 6 days. I believe you already have it. Ithra, please. Live, Ithra said simply. Both of you. That is the only instruction that still matters. I will make my way to the eastern shelter with what's left of the council. Go. The intercom clicked off. Sarethi stood frozen for one long moment, and Elias watched grief and terror war openly across her face for the first time since this had all begun. Not fear for herself, he realized, but fear of losing someone else, again, the way the last 2 years had taught her to expect. He took her hand. We don't have time to fall apart, he said gently. We have time to try. Let's try. The medical wing's emergency lighting bathed the pod in a dim amber glow, its glass cover already raised, its internal systems humming with a readiness that felt, to Elias, almost obscene given how little either of them actually knew about whether this would work. Strip to what the protocol requires, Sarethi said, her voice steadying itself through sheer force of will as she moved to the console, reciting the preparation steps Ithra had drilled into them both, a litany she clung to now the way a person clings to any ritual in the last moments before something irreversible. Direct skin contact maximizes the transfer efficiency. Core temperature regulation, respiratory synchronization, and pulse alignment all depend on it. Elias didn't hesitate. There was no room left, in the 4 hours the station had allotted them, for the kind of careful restraint he'd spent 3 years cultivating. He shed his outer layers, the cold already biting at his skin even through the medical wing's failing climate control, and turned to find Sarethi doing the same, her fur, softer than he'd ever let himself imagine, in the brief, guilty moments he'd allowed himself to imagine anything at all, catching amber light along the lines of her shoulders. "Are you afraid?" she asked, quiet, as they stepped toward the open pod together. "Yes," he admitted. "Are you?" "Terribly." A small, unsteady laugh escaped her. "I find I do not mind it as much as I expected to. Fear is easier to carry when it is shared." Somewhere beyond the sealed bulkhead, the alarms shifted pitch, a warning, Elias knew from a decade of listening to this station's failing voice, that the medical wing's own backup power had begun drawing down faster than projected. There was no more time to hesitate, no more room for the careful distances either of them had spent years maintaining out of habit rather than any real desire to keep them. Whatever this was between them, it had run out of patience for caution at exactly the same moment the station had. The pod was narrow, built, as advertised, for exactly one occupant, and settling into it together required a closeness that left no room for hesitation or pretense. Elias lay back first, and Sarethi settled against him, her body fitting along the length of his with an intimacy that felt, despite everything, less like desperation and more like arrival, like two people finally allowing themselves to occupy a space they had been circling for 3 careful years. "Breathe with me," she murmured, her voice close against his throat, her tail curling instinctively around his leg, anchoring them together. "Match my rhythm. Slow. Let your heartbeat listen to mine." He closed his eyes and did as she asked, focusing past the alarms still wailing faintly beyond the sealed bulkhead, past the tremor of fear still running beneath his skin, past everything except the warmth of her against him and the steady, patient sound of her breathing. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, minutes stretching like hours, he felt something in his own chest begin to answer hers. Not perfectly. Ithra had warned them it wouldn't be perfect. But close. Close enough, perhaps, to be a bridge rather than a gap. "The console shows convergence beginning," Sarethi whispered, reading the readout over his shoulder without lifting her head from his chest. 63% synchronization. We need 80 for the pod to accept dual stasis. "Then we're not done yet," Elias said, and drew her closer, close enough that her ear rested just beneath his jaw, close enough that he could feel, impossibly, the faint vibration of a purr beginning low in her chest, an involuntary response, he understood distantly, to comfort, to proximity, to the particular safety of being held by someone who had chosen her, fully, without condition. "Elias," she said softly, "whatever happens in that pod, I need you to know that choosing you was the easiest decision I have made in my entire life. Easier than any bloodline, any legacy, any duty anyone has ever placed on me. I chose you because you are the reason I still believe this universe is worth surviving in." He pressed his lips, gently, to the crown of her head, between the soft points of her ears, and felt her sigh against him, felt something in both their bodies settle, deepen, align. 79%. She breathed. 80. Elias, 81. The pod is accepting the protocol. The glass cover began its slow descent, servos whining with the particular strain of equipment older than either of them, and Sarethi's grip on him tightened, not with panic, he realized, but with the fierce, deliberate steadiness of someone choosing, consciously, again and again, not to let go. "If this fails," Elias started. "It will not," she said, with a certainty he suspected she manufactured for both their sakes. "And if it does, then it fails with us together, which is the only version of failing I could ever have accepted." The cover sealed with a soft hydraulic hiss, and cold, real cold, the deep, bone-settling cold of true cryogenic preparation, began creeping across the pod's interior in fine, spreading crystals of frost. "I made my choice long before the station began dying," Sarethi murmured, her voice growing softer as the sedative gases began to fill the chamber, her tail wrapping fully around him now, a final, deliberate anchor against the encroaching dark. I made it the first winter you gave away your own blanket to a Vulpine child you had known for 3 days. I made it the day you rationed your air for children who were not your own species, and told no one, because you did not do it to be thanked. Sarethi. If I must wake in a world without my people, she whispered, her eyes finding his through the gathering frost, gold catching the last of the amber light. Then let me wake beside the man who refused to leave them. Beside the man who taught me, without ever meaning to, what a life is actually worth. Her forehead rested against his, warm despite the deepening cold, her breath slowing to match his slowing to match hers, until it was no longer clear, no longer mattered. Which rhythm belonged to whom? I love you, Elias said, the words arriving without the careful hesitation he'd spent 3 years wrapping around them. I should have said it months ago. I love you, Sarethi. Whatever happens now, I need you to have heard that, clearly, at least once. Her ears lifted, and something in her expression, beneath the frost beginning to catch in her lashes, beneath the sedative pull already dragging at both of them, softened into pure, unguarded warmth. I have heard it, she whispered, in everything you have done for 3 years, long before you said the words. But I am glad, more glad than I can tell you, to hear them now. The last thing Elias felt, as the cold closed fully over them and the pod system settled into their improbable, borrowed rhythm, was Sarethi's tail tightening around him, and her lips, featherlight, brushing his jaw, a promise made in the last warm second before the dark. The station finished dying 6 hours after the pod sealed. Ithra and the surviving council members reached the eastern shelter with barely minutes to spare, and from there endured the 4-month wait in the same silence that spread across the rest of the failing colony, reduced systems, rationed everything, the particular grief of people who did not know whether the 2 occupants of a single-person pod, gambling on a 3-generation-old myth, were alive or already lost. There was no way to check. The pod systems, once sealed, ran in isolated protective stasis precisely to prevent the kind of external interference that might disrupt a fragile, still forming biological bond. Ithra had explained this before the seal descended, and had spent every one of the following 4 months hoping she had been right to let it happen at all. She kept a private log during those months, though she never intended anyone else to read it. Brief, clinical entries that grew steadily less clinical as the weeks wore on. Day 19, no data as expected. Reviewed the Cryosleep archive again regardless, searching for a reassurance the records were never written to provide. Day 47, Vantish asked me today whether I regretted allowing the attempt. I told him I did not have the luxury of regret, only of waiting. This was not entirely honest. Day 88, I dreamed last night that the pod opened and found nothing inside but frost. I did not tell the others. By the 3rd month, her entries had grown shorter still, as though the act of writing them had become its own quiet form of grief management, a way of surviving a silence that offered nothing back. The rescue convoy, delayed twice by logistical failures elsewhere in Vulpine space, finally arrived 4 months and 11 days after the reactor's collapse. 11 days later than projected, 11 days that Ithra later admitted had aged her more than the preceding 3 years of the colony's decline combined. The rescue team moved through the frozen, powerless corridors of Alaris 9 with the particular grim efficiency of people who had done this kind of recovery before and had learned not to hope for anything beyond confirmation. They found the medical wing intact, the emergency bulkhead having held exactly as Ithra had gambled it would, and approached the single cryogenic pod at its center with instruments already prepared to record whatever they found. The lead medical officer, a Vulpine woman named Corvus who had spent 15 years doing exactly this kind of recovery work and had long since stopped expecting surprises, ran her scanner across the pod's exterior and stared at the readout for a long moment before running it again, certain she had made an error. She had not made an error. "I'm reading 2 heartbeats," she said, her voice carrying an unsteadiness her 15 years of experience had not prepared her for. "Synchronized. Nearly identical rhythm. This unit is rated for single occupancy." Ithra, who had insisted on accompanying the recovery team despite Corvus's objections, pushed forward through the small crowd of rescuers with a speed that startled everyone present. She reached the pod's console with trembling hands and began the careful, methodical wake sequence, the same one she had rehearsed 100 times in her mind across 4 months of not knowing. The glass cover lifted with a groan of servos that had sat dormant far longer than their engineering tolerance recommended, and frost cracked and fell away in sheets, revealing, beneath it, 2 figures still wrapped together exactly as they had been sealed. Sarethi's tail still curled around Elias, his arms still holding her close, both of them beginning, slowly, to stir as warmth returned to the chamber for the first time in 4 months. Elias's eyes opened first, disoriented, chest working through the strange, deep ache of a body remembering how to breathe on its own rhythm again. Beside him, Sarethi stirred, her ears twitching, a low, confused sound escaping her throat before her golden eyes finally focused, found his, and widened. "We're alive," she rasped, her translated voice cracking with disuse. "We're alive," Elias confirmed, and felt something enormous and wordless break open in his chest. Relief, disbelief, and beneath both, a joy so complete it left him momentarily unable to speak at all. Ithera, standing at the console with tears cutting bright tracks through the fur of her face, let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Sureleth," she said, to no one and everyone. It held. Across species, under duress, with no proper ritual foundation but 3 years of an honest bond, it held. They were moved to the rescue convoy's medical bay for observation, still weak, still adjusting to bodies that had spent 4 months held in an impossible, borrowed rhythm, but alive, undeniably, improbably alive, and it was there, 3 days later, that Elias finally found the strength to ask the question that had been sitting quietly beneath every other thought since he'd woken. "What happens now?" Sarethi, propped against the medical bay's narrow cot beside him, her tail curled loosely around his hand in a gesture that had stopped feeling deliberate and started feeling simply like how her body existed near his, considered the question with the particular seriousness she gave to everything that mattered. "No," she said. "The Council, what remains of it, will want to study what we did." Sureleth successfully performed between species for the first time in recorded history. "It will not stay quiet, Elias. We will not be permitted to simply disappear into an ordinary life, if such a thing is even available to either of us anymore. Does that frighten you?" "A little," she admitted. "But less than it once would have. I spent my whole life being defined by what my bloodline might one day accomplish. Now I have accomplished something myself. Something that was never about the Kelther line at all, only about what 2 specific people chose to survive for." Her ears lifted, warm and unguarded. "I find I do not mind being known for that instead. And Elias Ward," she added, tilting her head, studying him with an expression that had, over 4 months of impossible shared dreaming, become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. "What do you want, now that the universe has, against every reasonable expectation, given you a future to want things in?" He thought about it, really thought about it, for the first time in years, without the constant background calculation of a dying colony's remaining days. "I want to stay wherever you're staying," he said finally. "I want to keep learning your language properly, instead of relying on the implant for everything. I want—" He stopped, huffed a small, disbelieving laugh at himself. "I want an ordinary life, Sarethi. Boring mornings. Arguments about nothing. The chance to annoy you for the next 60 years instead of just 3. Sarethi's laugh, when it came, was bright and unguarded in a way he had rarely heard from her before the pod. The laugh, he thought, of someone who had finally set down a weight she'd carried her whole life and discovered she could still stand upright without it. 60 years, she said. "That is a very specific and very optimistic number, Elias Ward." "I've always been an optimist," he said. "Ask anyone who watched me stay behind on a dying space station for a woman who kept correcting my grammar." "I corrected your grammar," she said, "because you were worth correcting." I do not waste effort on people I do not intend to keep. The question of what came next did not resolve itself easily. In the weeks following their rescue, while the convoy carried the last of Elias 9's survivors toward processing stations and temporary shelters scattered across 3 allied systems, Sarethi found herself courted. There was no gentler word for it. By no fewer than 2 Vulpine research institutes and 1 surviving fragment of the old colonial council, all of them eager to claim the last successful practitioner of a bonding ritual thought extinct for 3 generations. They want you to teach it, Elias said one evening, watching her set aside yet another formal request, this one bearing the seal of a university on a Vulpine core world neither of them had ever visited. Officially. As a discipline. They want the Keltha name attached to their research, Sarethi said, not without some weariness. It is not so different from what the Council on Elias 9 wanted, only dressed now in academic language instead of colonial survival. Do you want to teach it? She considered the question longer than he expected. Perhaps. Someday. Not, she added, catching his expression, because anyone requires it of me. If I ever stand in front of students explaining Sarethi, it will be because I have chosen to, freely, the way I chose the pod. Not because a bloodline owes the universe an explanation for surviving. Then what do you want now? Quiet, she admitted, something almost sheepish in the confession. I have spent my entire life being significant, Elias. Significant to a bloodline, significant to a council, and now, apparently, significant to an entire field of medical research I never asked to found. I find I would like, for a while, to simply be significant to one person, in small, ordinary ways that do not require a lecture hall. He understood that better than she perhaps realized. He had spent a decade being useful. To a colony, to a council, to a dying reactor that had demanded every spare hour he owned, and the notion of being needed by exactly one person, in exactly ordinary ways, felt less like a diminishment than like the first real rest either of them had been offered in years. They declined the university's invitation, and the institute's, and gently, but firmly, the council fragment's request that Sarethi make herself available for a formal commemorative address. Ithera, when informed of the decision, wrote back with unmistakable relief disguised thinly as professional detachment. You have done enough for one lifetime. Go be ordinary. I will handle the archives. It was Ithera, in fact, who found them the modest agricultural settlement at the edge of what had once been contested colonial space, a world neither prestigious nor particularly remarkable, chosen for exactly that reason. No one will ask you to be a legend there, she wrote. They will only ask whether you can fix a water reclamation valve, and whether the healer newly arrived in town takes emergency shifts on weekends. I thought you might both find that a relief. They did. They did not return to Elias 9. There was nothing left to return to. The colony was formally decommissioned 6 weeks after the rescue, its remaining structures left to the slow work of vacuum and time, a monument no one would visit but everyone who had survived it would carry regardless. The surviving colonists were resettled across 3 worlds, the council members scattered among old allies and new beginnings, Ithera taking up a research position studying the very bonding physiology she had helped resurrect from myth into medical fact. She wrote to Sarethi often, in the months that followed. Careful, detailed letters that read, beneath their clinical language, like the correspondence of someone still quietly amazed that the gamble she'd made in sealing a bulkhead behind 2 people she loved had paid off exactly as she'd hoped. Elias and Sarethi settled, eventually, on a modest agricultural world at the edge of what had once been contested colonial space, unremarkable, by galactic standards, which was precisely its appeal. He took work maintaining the settlement's water reclamation systems, work that felt almost luxuriously simple after a decade spent holding a dying station together through sheer stubbornness. She took up formal study of the healing gifts her bloodline was known for, no longer under the anxious scrutiny of elders measuring her against a legacy, but for the simple, unburdened reason that she found she enjoyed the work. They were not, by any Vulpine or human tradition, formally bonded. Not in the ceremonial sense, not yet. But the Cryosleep protocol had left something behind in both of them that no ceremony could have manufactured. A rhythm, faint but real, that Ithra's research eventually confirmed persisted long after the pod's systems had stopped enforcing it. Their heartbeats, she wrote in one particularly startled letter, still showed a measurable tendency to synchronize during periods of physical proximity. A permanent, low-level echo of the bond they had built under the worst 4 months either of them had ever lived through. "Scientifically fascinating," Sarethi said dryly, reading the letter aloud on their small home's narrow porch, evening light gold across the cultivated fields beyond. "Ithra wants to publish." "Let her," Elias said, tail-tip of Sarethi's tail brushing his ankle where it always found its way to, some habits having long since stopped requiring conscious thought. "Let the whole galaxy know. I'm not ashamed of it." "No," Sarethi agreed, leaning her head against his shoulder, the low, contented purr that had once seemed impossible between them now simply the sound of an ordinary evening. "Neither am I." Years later, enough years that the story of Elias IX's last cryogenic pod had passed from urgent medical case study into something closer to legend among Vulpine settlements across the sector. A young healer in training would ask Sarethi, during a public lecture on bonding physiology, what she believed the true lesson of the Cryosleep protocol actually was. Sarethi, gray now beginning to touch the rust of her fur, Elias beside her in the lecture hall's front row exactly as he had been beside her for every important moment of the last decade and a half, considered the question with the same seriousness she had given every question that mattered, from the council chamber of a dying colony to this quiet, ordinary auditorium. "The lesson," she said finally, "is not really about physiology at all. The pod did not save us because of clever engineering, or because two species happened to share enough biological common ground to make the numbers work. It saved us because two people had already spent years choosing each other, in 100 small, unglamorous ways, long before either of us understood what we were building. Elias taught me that a life's worth cannot be measured by what it can repay. I would like to think, in turn, that I taught him it is possible to be loved not for what you can offer a bloodline, a colony, or a cause, but simply, entirely, for who you already are." She reached for his hand, found it exactly where it always was, and smiled, the same unguarded, hard-won smile she had first shown him in the frost-rimed dark of a dying station's medical wing, for months and a lifetime ago. "That," she said, "is worth more than any legacy I was ever born to protect." The young healer in training, notes forgotten in her lap, would later describe that moment to a colleague as the point at which the lecture had stopped feeling like history and started feeling like something else entirely. Proof, perhaps, that the old stories about bonds strong enough to bridge impossible gaps had never really been myths at all, only truths waiting for two people willing enough, and stubborn enough, to prove them. Outside the auditorium, evening was settling gold and quiet over a world that had never known Elias IX, would likely never fully understand what had been lost when the station finally succumbed to vacuum and silence. But it did not need to understand the loss to recognize what had been carried forward from it. Two people, still choosing each other after everything, walking out together into an ordinary evening neither of them had ever been guaranteed, and both of them, after all this time, still faintly, unmistakably, breathing in time.